My name is Elizabeth Rebo, and I'm the Executive Director of Medication Safety for Kaiser Permanente's National Pharmacy Services. Today, I'm going to talk with you about the fundamentals of failure mode and effects analysis. I have no financial relationship to disclose as it relates to this presentation. We have two learning objectives for today. Some key abbreviations throughout this presentation. Our first self-assessment question is true/false. FMEA is defined as a proactive risk assessment method based on the simultaneous analysis of possible failures, their consequences, and associated risk factors. The second self-assessment question is multiple choice. Strengths of proactive risk assessment, such as FMEA, include which of the following? A, identify and correct the process before an error occurs. B, can proactively set expected standards for risky situations. C, engage staff and encourage proactive problem solving. D, save costs by being proactive versus reactive. And E, all of the above. So FMEA is a proactive risk analysis tool, and the focus is what could go wrong versus what did go wrong. So this is different than, say, a reactive type of risk analysis, such as a root cause analysis, where an event has happened, you're now retrospectively looking at it and trying to understand where the system vulnerabilities are so that you can correct these. So this is being more proactive, where an error hasn't necessarily occurred, but maybe you've got new technology, a new process, something like that, where you want to make sure that you think through any unintended consequences that could occur and proactively mitigate against those. So as we look at the different words in the FMEA, this slide actually explains what those words mean. So failure, this is where something, and maybe in healthcare this will be more around a system or a process, but is performing in a way that's not planned and or expected. Mode is identifying the way that something can fail. So for each step, what is the way that it could actually fail in the process? Effects are going to be the consequences of the failure mode. So as each one of those modes happen, what will be the consequence if the failure occurred? And then analysis being the examination of the process or the product. A definition of FMEA is the proactive risk assessment method based on the simultaneous analysis of possible failure modes, their consequences, and associated risk factors. So a couple of slides ago, when I was going through the definitions, you saw the FMECA and HFMEA. It really doesn't matter what term you use. The processes are generally the same, but there are, if you look in the literature, a variety of different ways that you can use and conduct an FMEA, whether you use FMECA or HFMEA, it really doesn't matter so long as you are identifying the risk points and then developing an action plan to correct those. A couple of terms on the right-hand side. So potential failure mode, a failure point or gap in the process or workflow. So this is really helping the group, the team, to understand the way that the failure occurs to create an event or outcome that was not planned or desired. So what would happen, and then what will be the result should that failure actually occur? All of that will be part of the process of the FMEA. And I will go through several examples in the next PowerPoint, so please don't be alarmed if this isn't making sense to you quite yet. Potential failure modes, this is the consequence or the effect of a failure mode. So this will be part of what is collected during the failure mode process in and of itself. So I want to talk a minute about proactive risk detection. So this is proactive risk detection is looking at organizational risk and hopefully correcting that before an event occurs. So if anyone here that's taking this course is in some type of quality improvement role, you know that you really have to have a strategy around both. You have to have proactive risk assessment work, but you also have to have reactive risk assessment work, because we know events are going to happen and we must do causal analysis to understand the why behind it so that we can take the appropriate corrective actions. But this is a great tool to use for proactive risk assessment. Again, I love to use this when new technology is coming into the organization, so that I can really understand, are there going to potentially be some unintended consequences that we haven't thought through, so that we can mitigate those before the technology is implemented in the organization. So I've already mentioned that FMEA is a great tool for proactive risk assessment. or detection, but there's a couple of others here. I really just put these in this PowerPoint for inclusive sake, just so that if you have more of an interest in proactive risk detection, you can understand what are some other methods that can be used. Stuff such as leadership rounding, using external resources or alerts, PDSA, Plan, Do, Study, Act, Lean, Six Sigma, any of those quality and process improvement methods are proactive risk detection methods. So the purpose of a FMEA, I've already talked about this a good bit, but really looking at how do we analyze the steps in a process, looking for the failures, what would cause the failures, and then of course their criticality. So based upon that criticality, improvements are made to prevent or mitigate the effects of the process failures. We really want in these events or in these failure modes to target a high risk or high vulnerability area. I can tell you from my own experience in doing and conducting FMEAs, even though I have always tried to have a narrow scope so that it doesn't get to be an overwhelming process, it always ends up being a little bit more intensive than I thought. I had one failure mode from years ago that I was conducting, and it just every time that we would have a conversation about a specific part, it would like branch off, and so it quickly became much too big from a scope perspective, and we had to scale that back. So when it says to focus on a specific part, that's why, because it truly can end up taking months if you don't be very clear about your scope. And then as you're finding maybe potential new areas, put those in a parking lot and come back to those at a later time. And the last point here that's really important is that it's conducted by a multidisciplinary team. So for whatever process that you're looking at, or maybe a new technology, anyone who will have their hands on that or in it, please make sure that you include all those disciplines so that you can have the perspective of everyone who will be involved in the process or using the new product or tool. So for what processes should a FMEA be completed? So it could be a review of reported events or occurrences, perhaps like near misses. You can do that. I know that may sound a little bit more retrospective, but it could be like I've used this before when we've seen a cluster of great catches. Like, okay, the system is working. We know that people are catching the issues and the errors before they happen, but there's something wrong with the underlying system. So let's uncover that and then mitigate risk that way. Also, high-risk processes that may pose a risk, anything that maybe involves high alert medications, or again, new technology like infusion pumps that have interoperability with the EMR, things like that, where this is going to be a new process, a new workflow for everyone involved. How do we make sure that we don't have those unintended consequences? Joint Commission, the Sentinel event alerts, the SEAs the Joint Commission puts out, great opportunity there to do FMEAs. And Joint Commission does require organizations to do at least one FMEA every 18 months. So it doesn't have to be medication related, but there are so many opportunities in the medication space that I personally have always enjoyed doing FMEAs that are medication related to meet that Joint Commission requirement. I've already talked about this multiple times already, but in preparation for new equipment, new services, or a unit, or maybe even a department opening, maybe this is a new type of service that the organization is offering. That is a great opportunity to do FMEA to make sure there's no unintended consequences. And then this kind of goes along with the Joint Commission Sentinel Events Alert, but processes that support compliance with the Joint Commission National Patient Safety Goals, a lot of opportunity there to do some proactive risk detection. Healthcare FMEA, so this is the HFMEA. This is a modified approach to FMEA that's applicable specifically for healthcare. Very similar again in scope for what you would see with any FMEA. And like I said, I don't necessarily care if it's a HFMEA versus a FMEA versus the one that's got the criticality in there as well. They all do the same thing, so it really doesn't matter. Just choose a methodology that works for you and what will work for your organization. You'll get to the same place. So this is a graphical depiction of FMEA on the right-hand side. I put it in here. This is something that we developed at one of my previous organizations just to outline the different steps. We'll go through this in more detail, so I won't spend a lot of time on this slide, but just a nice graphical representation of the FMEA process, starting with selecting the process to analyze and all the way through measuring success. So just a nice little framework, perhaps if you're not familiar with FMEA or haven't done one before. So the healthcare FMEA, 5 steps in this one. One is defining the FMEA topic. And so I call out here again the narrow scope, just based on personal experience, how important it is to be very, very clear about the scope. And then when you start to have scope creep, that you put that into a parking lot. Assembling the multidisciplinary team, very important. And also what we want to call out here is the inclusion of fresh eyes. So someone who maybe doesn't have experience with the process, hasn't been involved, someone who can offer a completely different perspective. And if you've done any type of work like this in the past, or even say like root cause analyses, what you will see if you employ someone who has that fresh eyes perspective, they can really help you see your blind spots. Because once we get so involved, ingrained in a process or a workflow, or just are too close to the work, sometimes you just can't see what someone who comes in with a fresh perspective can see. So I always enjoy having somebody who has no knowledge of the process whatsoever attend to failure mode so they can provide that fresh eyes perspective. Third step, really important, you have to process and flow map out the workflow or process so that everyone can understand what is supposed to happen. So kind of outlining what the process is, and then of course tearing that apart as you do the FMEA to look for the failure modes and the effects with that. The fourth step in a healthcare FMEA is to conduct a hazard analysis, looking for your potential failure modes, identifying those, and then doing the scoring, which again, we're going to walk through examples with this. And then the last step is developing actions and outcome measures. Really important with everything that you do with the FMEA. It's going to be important to understand what are the actions we're going to take, and then to rescore at the end after you've implemented your action plans to understand, did the actions that you implemented actually make a difference and decrease risk, which is of course our goal. So with completing an FMEA, this is the last slide was around healthcare FMEA, which is really more defined with those 5 steps. This is one that's a little bit more, I would say, of a traditional FMEA. Again, it does not matter which version you choose. It just gives a little bit more of additional information. For example, I think this is 10 steps versus the healthcare FMEA, which was only 5. But again, very, very similar. So with conducting an FMEA, identifying the subject of analysis in the process and making sure that in your header, and I've got multiple templates that I'll show you that you can use. And again, totally up to the organization and what works for you and the way you think, but making sure you've got your team information and what process that you are including or working on in your header on your document. You're going to list your steps of the process in the first column. The third will be to identify potential failures for each process step or outcome. So as you go through each process step, you're going to identify those failures. And I want to call out here that you can have multiple failures for process steps. So you want to really brainstorm and think of what are all the different causes or potential failures that this particular process could have. I mean, I've had sometimes where it's been 5 or 6 different potential failure modes based on one process step. Then step 4, you're going to want to determine the actual or potential effect of the failure. So what would be the cause if the failure actually happened? Number 5, you're going to rank the severity of the effect using a standard scale, with higher being worse. I'll go through that in a few minutes, but typically that's going to be on a scale of 1 to 10. 6, listing the potential causes for each failure. 7, you're going to rank the expected occurrence of failure. So how often would that failure happen if it weren't detected? 8, list how the failure is currently detected or controlled. So what do we already have in place that would help this event from not happening, for this failure from occurring? And then rating the detectability of a failure. So if it does occur, how easily will it be detected? Is there a process where there's someone else downstream that would catch it? Maybe there's technology in place, really trying to understand if this failure occurred, how easily could we detect it before it reaches the patient? Step number 10 with the FMEA is calculating the RPN. That's your risk priority number, and that is calculated by multiplying your severity, occurrence, and detectability, all 3 together. The higher the number, the riskier the process. That's the rule of thumb there. Step 11, for high-risk failures, determine any recommended actions that could prevent or mitigate the failure, and assign responsibility and target dates for actions. So developing that action plan and holding people accountable to doing that. And then, like I stated a little while ago, what you'll want to do is, after you've given the actions time to work, you're going to want to come back together and rescore the RPN. Again, that's the risk priority number, which is calculated by calculating up the severity, occurrence, and detectability and multiplying those together. That gives you your RPN. You're going to want to rescore that, and hopefully what you will see is a lower number because you have now made the process safer because you've eliminated hopefully some of the risk. So I've talked a lot about the different steps, but maybe putting it into a little bit more actionable information for you. I hope that this will help. So the first process with identifying the process and defining the scope, I love this Stephen Covey quote, begin with the end in mind. That's really what you want to do whenever you are starting upon this journey. Again, I've had experiences where it's gotten a little bit out of hand because we had too much scope creep and I didn't pull back on the FMEA team with that. So really defining what the parameters of the FMEA will be up front is really, really important. I've said this numerous times, but I'll say it again. If the process is complex, just scope a defined part of the process. So really just look at a narrow scope of whatever you deem as most worthy and most needed of some type of process improvement so that you can have some actionable items and be able to see the progress. It should have a clear beginning and ending. So again, not allowing scope creep to come in. It does need to be broad enough for significant impacts. So making sure that you look at a process and we're getting the most bang for your buck. This is time intensive doing an FMEA. So you want to make sure that you're choosing work that's high meaning and valuable for the organization. So writing a topic statement is really the first step, if you will, after you've established what your process is going to be. You want to describe what is being analyzed, describe the boundaries, i.e. the scope. You want your statement to be clear and concise. It needs to be brief, only 1 or 2 sentences. So I have a couple of examples at the bottom of this slide. So one can be handoff of sepsis patients from ED to ICU. Another example, cleaning for non-critical reusable medical equipment in inpatient care areas. So again, most of the folks taking this course are probably going to be pharmacists. So there are numerous types of processes that you can look at for FMEA. It could be chemo processes. It could be dispensing of medications using IV room technology. There's a whole host of different areas that you could use FMEA in the pharmacy. Looking at scope, the consent process and where do you start? This is an example of one. So of just where you can see that scope could get a little bit out of control. So this was an example we talked about in my previous organization as an example of really honing in on why it's so important to be very, very clear around scope. But consent process, you guys, I know, are very familiar with how broad of a topic that could be. Is it, for example, all procedures? Are you maybe only looking at outpatient procedures, outpatient CT guided procedures? So as you start to work with the team to define the scope, these are questions you can start to ask yourself. Where do we see the biggest risk? Where do we have the most concern? And here's a couple of other examples as well, like chemotherapy dispensing process. Is there something specifically within that? Maybe it's the ordering and the communication to the pharmacy. Maybe it's the communication back and forth as it relates to labs. Whatever it is that you can really narrow in on so that your scope can be pretty tight. Next, with an FMEA, you want to plan. So you've now identified your opportunity for an FMEA. So this can be organizational dependent. So I call it out, but it may or may not be a factor for yourself as you're working through doing an FMEA. But there may be a need to present data in the scope of an FMEA to an oversight committee within the organization. Maybe there's a quality committee. Again, with organizations that are Joint Commission accredited and needing to do an FMEA every 18 months, this may be something you would want to collaborate with the quality department or regulatory department, whoever oversees that type of work, to see if they would be supportive of doing a med-related FMEA to suffice for that requirement. But just making sure and calling out that if you need to have some type of approval by an organizational body or a body within your organization, to make sure to do that. Also think this last bullet on the left side is really important. Gaining approval for the team is a high priority. I think this is so critical because there is, again, this is a big time commitment. So you need commitment from leadership that this is a high priority and that whatever is identified and decided upon by the team to work on from an actions related perspective, you want to make sure that leadership supports that and will support the work. I don't think there's anything worse than going through the exercise of doing an FMEA and spending all of that time identifying risk and then not having the resources or the time or the bandwidth or whatever to be able to actually take the results of the FMEA and do the work to correct the problems and the concerns. And then, of course, the last part of planning is assembling the multidisciplinary team. I think it's really important to make sure that you have people that do the work as part of the FMEA. It certainly would not make sense for myself as a leader to go in and try to serve as a subject matter expert in an FMEA when I don't do the work. So again, this is why this is such a labor intensive type of work, is that now you're having to pull frontline staff to serve. So you want to make sure that you're spending your time wisely with teams as you're pulling them off the front line. Also, of course, making sure you have a leadership and executive sponsor, or perhaps it's multiple people that are there to serve in that capacity to help ensure that the work that's identified is actually completed. The first FMEA meeting, so some items that you can put on your agenda. First is around establishment of ground rules. Maybe your organization already has ground rules for things like this, so I would use those, or maybe even create your own. Being very clear about expectations around team commitment and participation. So this is something that I have stumbled upon in the past as being problematic, especially when you get into scoring, when you're calculating the RPNs and doing all the scoring associated with that. When you don't have the same people there consistently doing that work, you can actually see that start to fluctuate in a way that's going to skew the information, because maybe now on day 3, you've got someone who's very outspoken and feels a certain way and is kind of driving the team and the conversation in a different way than the dynamic was when they weren't there. So again, very important to get that leadership commitment to have all team members be present at all of the meetings that are occurring. I've already talked about the FMEA statement, but calling out again, that's going to be important to ground the team. Reviewing what a FMEA is and what the high-level steps are. This is really important. Most of the time, you're going to have people doing an FMEA who've never done one before. And there are parts of it that can really trip people up. So very important to be very clear and to constantly come back to that, especially during the scoring portion of the FMEA, to make sure that everybody understands. The FMEA terminology and rating skills, again, this is a place where I can see, or I have seen, that people have gotten confused, so very important to explain that. I typically will print out a piece of paper with a lot of this information, just kind of a quick and dirty about FMEA, and keep that, and give it to everybody at the start of the FMEA, and then take it back up at the end, and then redistribute it every time we have a meeting, so that it just consistently reminds the team members of what we're doing, what the scoring looks like, all of that, so that there's not confusion. And then tying into principles of high reliability. I think at this point, most organizations are well on their way on a journey towards high reliability. So always like to tie that back in as well as we're doing FMEA. So process mapping, I imagine if you are taking this course that you are pretty well versed in process improvement and process mapping, but just calling it out here is a critical step of the FMEA, listing out the steps that are routinely done and map the process. If you need to go and do Gemba, go to where the work is being performed to actually observe the process. I would certainly encourage folks to do that. And observing the actual process and not the policy is written. So, we're not necessarily worried about what the policy says, but we want to list out the steps as they occur, because that might be part of the problem. So really important to observe the actual practice and not just assume that the policy is being followed. Now that you've completed the process map, it's time to conduct the analysis. So once you have all your steps in the process map outlined, then you're going to identify all the failures that may occur in each step. So identifying your failure modes. One thing I want to call out here is that each process step may have multiple potential failure modes. So it's really important to give the FMEA team the space and the time to think through all the different potential failure modes that may exist. This is really important. You don't want to forget something. After you've identified all the failures, then you want to identify the potential effect of the failure, so the consequences. And again, each failure mode may have multiple potential effects and causes of failure. And I just want to encourage you to give your team and yourselves enough time to let people have the opportunity to think through. You may want to come back to this over a couple of different sessions, not just try to do it in one hour or 2 hour session, because people will inevitably come back with other ideas and things that they've thought about in between sessions of the FMEA. After you've identified the potential effects of the failure, the consequences, then you will start to look at and identify the potential causes of the failures. After that, you're going to want to overlay on the process map. So I personally like to use different color sticky notes. Again, whatever works for you and your organization, maybe you have a method that works best for you. So this is just for me, how I like to do it. So it's just a suggestion in regards to how I've done these in the past. And I do like to call out that I do one failure mode per sticky note on the corresponding process map. So just making sure that you're able to understand on the process map where the failures are, what are the effects, the consequences of each failure, and then what are the causes of the failures, and being able to identify and put that on your process map. The tie-in with high reliability principles, I talked about that on an earlier slide, but want to call it out here just as a reminder to you all about the high reliability principles that exist and what they mean. So the FMEA process, I've talked a lot about how it should look, but not really given any pictures and such. And so I think this will hopefully help bring all of this together in a way that makes sense. So the picture that you see on the screen, this is from one of my previous organizations and how we constructed our Excel spreadsheet to capture this information. So the process, and this is the biggest part of the spreadsheet, is looking at what are the process steps, the failure modes, potential effects of the failure. You can see here with the items that have the 1 through 10, these are the areas that you're going to score to get the RPN. So as a reminder, the risk priority number, RPN, is the detection, the occurrence, and the severity, all three of those multiplied together to give you a number. And then, like I said in one of the previous slides, the current controls, really important to have that on there so that we can understand what's already in place to mitigate risk, because that, of course, will impact what we end up doing from an action plan perspective. Here are some of the definitions for scoring. So severity, what is the severity of the failure mode if it were to reach the patient? The way I think about this is that if at any step the patient severity could result in death, I give that a 10. So another thing I want to remind you guys that I said before is the higher the number, the riskier the score. So keep that in mind as we're talking through the scoring definitions. So 10 being the most severe, if higher is worse, then 10 severe death, that makes sense from a severity perspective. Occurrence, this is a little different. So what is the expected occurrence of failure mode of how likely or often this particular failure occurs? So again, thinking that higher is worse. If the occurrence is 10, is highly likely or very frequently that the occurrence would, or if the failure occurs that you're going to have the occurrence, then that would give you a higher score. So occurrence of a 1 is unlikely or never, whereas a 10 is highly likely or very frequently that the failure mode, that the particular failure is going to actually happen. Detection. This is one where people get a little tripped up when they're doing the scoring because it's almost like the reverse. So with detection, it's the likelihood that the failure will be identified before it occurs. So how likely is it that it would be detected? So a detection of 10 means that it will never or very rarely be detected. So that's worse, right? Like, so think about it from the perspective of the higher the RPN, the riskier the process. So with detection, if we could rarely detect it, then it's going to be more risky. So that's why a detection of 10 would be for something that's never or rarely detected. Whereas a detection of 1 would be we've got some type of control in place that we're always going to be able to detect it. So this is the detection one where people can sometimes get very confused because you think higher is more. But in this case, in detection, higher is less because we want to have a riskier score associated with a higher number. And then the RPN, like I've talked about before, is just multiplying the three of these together. So let's do an example. And this is not medication related, but it will hopefully help you understand how FMEA works from a very, very simple example. So outpatient radiology process. The process step example we're going to look at is that the patient comes to check-in desk. The patient can't find the check-in desk. That's the potential failure mode. And the potential effects of this failure could be they're getting late getting their x-ray or they have a treatment delay. So with this example, again, calling out because this is so important, rule of thumb, higher the score, the greater the risk. The riskier the process when you multiply all three of these numbers together. So with this example, these are the numbers that were assigned by the team, and you can see there's an RPN of 168. Within this particular example, a multidisciplinary team would come together, develop action plans and items to mitigate the cause of failure, assign owners and the target completion date, and document the action taken. So the graphic that I have here is again taken from that Excel spreadsheet that one of my previous organizations we created. And this is the actions part, so you can see that all parts of those are there so that it can be documented in the official FMEA form so that we are taking the appropriate actions. I think this is also really important too, is that you need to give some time for the process to work before reassessing. So you don't want to implement a new process and 2 weeks later, see if it's working. And if it is, great, but if not, then think that maybe it's failed. That's certainly not the case. Sometimes it takes time to see a process work. I think it's going to totally depend on what process it is as to how long you need to wait. I don't have a rule of thumb for anything like that. It really just depends on the particular process and what I'm assessing, but I would give it at least a couple of months, maybe even longer, depending on the process, to come back and relook at that. So after you have been able to give the process some time to work, you want to come back, rescore, recalculate the RPM. And in this example, you can see that the RPM went from 168 down to 72. So what that means to us is that we have a safer or more effective process, which of course is our desire from doing FMEA. Now that we've gone through an example of a FMEA, let's review some of the risks associated with FMEA. The first is around the process being defined too narrowly or too broadly. I've talked about that extensively throughout this presentation, and it's worth mentioning here again. This can really hinder your progress with the FMEA. I personally have had an experience where we had our scope too broad, and it took several months to be able to complete the FMEA. So it's very important that you look at that closely when you are defining the process. The second is around important stakeholder perspectives not being included. Very important that you're able to have all key stakeholders involved and engaged in at each meeting so that you can make sure that no important pieces are overlooked. A third risk is that additional failure modes at linkages between steps or between process and its support systems are overlooked. Very important again here, the key stakeholders can help ensure that this does not happen. A fourth risk is that the process for prioritization is overly complex and time consuming. This is also a place where teams can get hung up. As you go through an FMEA, most likely you will have a good bit of process steps you have to review and prioritize. You don't want to spend a ton of time on this step because you really want to focus your energy and your efforts around fixing the problems versus trying to decide where you want to prioritize. A fifth risk is around superficial causes being identified. So this is where a team can get into trouble by not digging deep enough within the process. And again, not having your key stakeholders and SMEs, subject matter experts who really know and understand the process. If you don't have those folks there at your FMEA, this is where this particular risk really comes into play. And the last risk is the effectiveness of the improvement interventions are not measured. It's very important at the end of your FMEA to go back, rescore, and ensure that the intervention that was chosen actually had the desired outcome and you see a reduction in your RPN so that you can be assured that the improvement intervention actually resulted in success. So strings of proactive risk identification, and again, FMEA is a proactive risk identification or detection method. But this is inclusive of all different types of proactive risk identification. So I want to be clear, this isn't just about FMEA, but for any type of proactive risk detection method. You can identify and correct the process before an error occurs. That's of course what we would like to do in healthcare. Some are relatively easy to use. So using something like an external newsletter, very easy to assess risk in your organization. Something like an FMEA takes a lot more time. The ability to recognize and control at-risk situations, that may be something that you just have a blind eye to from voluntary reporting. Perhaps folks just aren't reporting those, especially if it's great catches or near misses. And so doing FMEA is a great way to uncover some of those areas of opportunity. It also engages the staff and encourages proactive problem solving. So I think that's important. I talked about how important it is to get frontline folks involved in the FMEA. This is where we want, I always say I'm a med safety leader. I always say that every pharmacist and pharmacy technician is a med safety officer. And so I would say the same thing with quality improvement. We expect and want all of our staff to really own quality improvement and helping us identify fixes. It also gives you the opportunity to train staff on tools such as FMEA. So that's going to really start to shift their mindset, I would hope, to where they are actively looking for problems and problem solving. It can proactively set expected standards for risky situations. So again, especially as we focus on high reliability, this comes into play. And you can, of course, save costs by being proactive versus reactive. Some limitations of proactive risk identification, resource commitment. So this is big. FMEA, again, I had one that took months, and that was a big commitment by leadership of their staff to be able to be involved in that. It necessitates senior leadership support, very important, again, especially as you are developing action plans and may need leadership to help remove barriers so that those can be implemented. Specifically during the FMEA, some limitations. You can mistakenly assign higher qualitative ratings to qualitatively smaller risk. That's a challenge. Severity categorization can't be made objectively for uncertain consequences. That's also a little bit of a challenge. But again, if you're keeping the same team there, you can at least be consistent in how you're approaching it. It is subjective, the assessment of likelihood, consequence, and resulting risk ratings, very subjective. But again, keeping that consistent team, you can at least be consistent with that. And bottom line, FMEA is just, it is subjective. But again, it's a very useful tool that can be used in healthcare. So I don't, even though there are some limitations to using the tool, I do think that the benefits outweigh the risks. So moving back to our self-assessment questions. Number one, FMEA is defined as a proactive risk assessment method based on the simultaneous analysis of possible failure modes, their consequences, and associated risk factors, true or false. The answer is true. And number two, strengths of proactive risk assessment, such as FMEA, include which of the following? A, identify and correct the process before an error occurs. B, can proactively set expected standards for risky situations. C, engage staff and encourage proactive problem solving. D, save costs by being proactive versus reactive. Or E, all of the above. And the answer is E, all of the above. So in conclusion, FMEA is a useful tool for proactive risk assessment, but should not be used for retrospective risk review. And it can be subjective, which must be taken into consideration. Here are some of my references. And thank you so much for your time today.